We worked with this gentleman that his trust said he got distributions for several things, but one of them was when he got married, he would get a pretty significant distribution. Well, he figured out a loophole. It didn't say he only had to be married once. So he kept getting married and getting divorced, then getting married again and getting divorced. And when we met him, he was on his 7th marriage because every time he got married, it was almost like a business. At this point, honestly, he was giving part of his distribution to whoever decided to marry him. And so I think also being wary of how exactly are you wording this? Like, what, to your point, like, what's the intent? Welcome to Planning Reimagined, a podcast from the planning experts at Robin Glenn and RX Investment Partners for wealthy families and successful business owners. Hi, I'm Celeste Moya. Welcome to another episode of Planning Reimagined. Today's episode is part of a series that's focused on wealth building through real estate. So in our previous episodes, we touched on topics such as ownership structure, smart tax planning, estate preservation. So if you've missed any of those episodes, please be sure to check them out. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that is just as crucial as it is overlooked. What happens after you pass the wealth to your heirs? So we're going to be talking about how to prepare your heirs, because we all know that wealth preservation isn't just about who gets what. It's about ensuring that they are actually prepared to handle it. So how can we ensure that your legacy thrives in the hands of that next generation? Join us as we discuss some of those great tips and tricks and pointers, secrets kind of behind the scenes of how you can ensure your heirs are prepared properly. So we're thrilled to be joined today by Courtney, Joyner, Gage. Thank you so much for joining us today, Courtney.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, she is the founder of Mariposa Advisors, and she's an expert in family engagement, impact, and philanthropy. So we're so glad you can join us for this conversation. And then we also have our very own Mike Mazzone, who in his words is a recovering estate planning attorney and CPA. So we're very glad that we're joined by these two folks that have a lot of expertise on this topic. And I know both of you have firsthand seen the impact that either preparing your heirs or not preparing your heirs can have on a family. So getting that firsthand experience in some of the scenarios that you've seen is going to be incredibly helpful. So let's just go ahead and jump into it. We can kind of start at the basics of it. So I guess if we want to refer to it as Finance 101, teaching heirs financial responsibility. So many times when we talk about estate planning or financial planning, instead of it being something like interactive where they feel involved, it sounds more like a lecture. So Courtney, if you can kind of kick us off and tell us, how can we help our audience, our viewers, our listeners prepare their heirs in a way where they feel like they're not just spectators, but they're actually stakeholders in the family?
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me. So I think that when people think about finance, it's not automatically how fun. I'm so excited to sit down and learn about financial topics. So the first example that comes to mind is a multi-generational family that I've worked with for many years. They have a family foundation, and their Rising Gen members were probably in their 20s to 30s and had actually actively asked for the financial topics to be excluded from their foundation meeting. They truly did not want to talk about it. It was so boring to them. And as fiduciaries, they needed to talk about it. And so we found a way, listening to what they're interested in, to actually find a way to engage them. So we heard them say, we love philanthropy, we love making an impact, and impact investing particularly was interesting to them. So we decided that we would try out implementing a portion of their portfolio in impact investing and gather those Rising Gen members, and have them be stakeholders in the process. And so they guided us on what their interests were, what their, what they wanted to invest in. And we were able to incorporate financial topics, whether it be traditional investing or impact investing, into those committee meetings. We created an investment committee, and it actually ended up being about 10 family members joined from the Rising Gen. And so they went from not even wanting to talk about it to leading that part of the family foundation meeting, because they had a part in that. They felt that their values and their interests were being reflected in the family. And so it just kind of turned the whole scenario around, and it made it really fun. And I know another thing that we've talked about is family retreats. And to me, these are such a fun way to incorporate education into a family activity. So actually with this same family, they have about 70 to 80 family members that get together every year. They change locations every summer. It's just like this fun, big family retreat. And I've been involved in helping them plan for a few years now. And so this past year, we focused on not a financial topic, but family history, actually. Mm-hmm. And so it was great to incorporate that for all ages. So thinking about the little kids, they had some children ages 5 to 7. And in advance, we actually created a coloring book for them. Their great-grandmother started a very successful business. And so we created a coloring book for them about her journey.
That's so cute.
It was so cute. And so, it had quotes from her and the story of how she went from being a single mom to really working hard, involving her kids eventually, and creating this family business that supported people around the world. And so it was really precious because then at the actual meeting, we did a timeline and had the little kids put the family photos up on the wall with the timeline. And at one moment, one of the 5-year-olds grabbed the photo and said, "I know who this is. This is my great-grandmother, and this is the company that she made." Wow. It was pretty incredible and impactful for someone at that age to be able to connect the dots in that way and say, "I fit in the story here. And this is my great-grandmother who I've never met, but I can tell you about her." And so we did that with the little kids. We played trivia with the teenagers, had buzzers, we had candy, we had prizes. We made it really fun and interactive. And then for the entire family, we integrated that same family timeline and put it up in a communal area. And they were able to talk about it throughout, their casual conversations, tell family stories. We had them all put their names up on the timeline and their year of birth. And so they could all see, even though, they live across states, there's, 70 of them, that they're all connected and they all have this shared family history and they're all part of the same family story. And so I think that is really key in thinking about how to make it fun and engaging, kind of thinking outside of the box and to connecting the dots for people about why does this matter? How do I fit in? How does it relate to me?
First of all, the fact that you can get 70 to 80 family members together, and hopefully there was no issue. If my family and we got 70 or 80 people together, there would definitely be some kind of a disagreement. And I'm putting disagreement nicely, So that's great that you can do that, first of all. But all those things you shared are so true. I mean, I have a 7-year-old, Mike, you have little ones too. And keeping them engaged is very hard in any activity that we're doing. And so if you can have a 5-year-old recognize, their great-grandmother and something like that, clearly what you've done, it was working for them. So kind of what I heard you say too is you have to align them to their interests. The first family or the first example that you shared, that was something that interested them. And that's a great point. And Mike, I'm sure you've seen this too and probably have some insight, but not every family member is going to have the same strength. So some might be more financially savvy. Others may want to have nothing to do with the finances, but may love to plan the family retreat too, right?
Yep.
So you have to kind of play to that. I don't know, Mike, anything you've experienced in that space?
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. It's really, which is kind of a tragedy. You can kind of see it coming a mile away, but they always got the one person who that next gen who is, maybe more financially savvy, carries a heavier burden. And then it just, their siblings or cousins at the end of the day, they just rely on them almost to the greater whole's detriment, right? So it's really important. And I'd like to, understand, how Courtney kind of re-engages those maybe younger, generation twos, or some, just how they re-engage them in a position where they are feeling empowered, to make decisions, not feeling, overwhelmed by the decisions that are being made at a higher level. And just generally, estate planners, my group is not really in tune to a lot of that items, There's not a lot of recovering estate planners who become psychologists or stand-up comics or anything along those lines. So just being able to.
That's why we have people like Courtney. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's exactly. So how, what could, people from my side really do to at least engage or start that conversation? Because all parties want it. They just don't know how to get there. It's just like, this is the way we've always done it. This guy takes care of this. This woman takes care of that. And we kind of keep it moving. And that's, a recipe for disaster. And I'd always want to take a step back before we start talking about all the tax nerdery that I talked about and really say, hey, let's make sure everyone's aligned and everyone has input at this point because it's an inflection point on your legacy.
And if they don't feel involved, it's going to be easy for them to kind of separate themselves from the family. It starts to create other issues. Or if they feel, obviously, somebody's getting preferential treatment because they are the accountant, they do have that expertise, then to your point, Mike, you don't want anybody to feel like they're burdened by it, but you also don't want people to feel resentment if somebody else is having to carry the load, which is why it's also important to start them young. I see all these things, having, once again, a young child, how to prepare them early to be financially savvy. And that's a whole other conversation, but also important.
That's a good point, though. It goes both ways, right?
Right.
Because the resentment is the one who's kind of leading the charge. The other ones feel resentment that they have too much power, but the opposite's true. The ones who aren't as active have complaints. The person who's running the day-to-day operations, like, hey, I'm in the weeds here. I'm feet on the ground here, so I'm the one making decisions. That's where it all kind of devolves from there. So as to get everyone rowing in the same direction, both as far as information flow and decision making, as much as you can. I think that's always the best class or best in class family owned business, family owned real estate business.
But I love that retreat idea. And that's so good to be able to, because that's an easy way to incorporate lots of different generations into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And y'all brought up a lot of great points. I am of the belief that every family has a huge, diverse set of skills and strengths. I've seen this family execute it very well. And the fact that, like you said, they have someone planning the family retreat. They have different people planning different sessions. They have someone who leads the committee afterwards, somebody who's involved in the family foundation. And so there's people who work in the business, but not everybody does. So everybody has their different roles. And that helps with the engagement and feeling empowered to have some, decision making within the family, that not one person feels too imbalanced, that they can all take a piece and work together and move towards that common family goal.
And it's going to be for the benefit of the whole family at the end of the day, if they can do that.
Yes.
And the next generation see that when people are working together.
Absolutely. And they've done a great job from the leading generation, training up the rising generation and having them be involved, being on advisory committees and, being able to watch meetings take place even before they can participate, so that once they are of an age or of an ability to join, they have the skills and they're ready to go. So they've done a really fantastic job doing that.
That's great. And those are great examples and great things for it's easy things that our audience can implement.
Absolutely.
Even if it's not a giant retreat, they can still start to plan smaller meetings that incorporate each family member in whatever way makes sense for them.
Yes, absolutely. I don't think family retreats are the best fit for everyone.
Not for my family.
No, but family meetings could be great, and it could just be over the dinner table, meeting once a year or every quarter or something like that. It's very attainable for many families.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, we've talked about kind of starting to have those initial financial conversations. Now, if we get to the point of what we talked about in the beginning, kind of the intro to the session is really preparing your heirs for when they're going to inherit that wealth, when they're really going to take that baton in the business and the family, whatever it is that is going to be passed on to them. And distributing assets. That's a question that we get from clients a lot. How do I treat each of my kids fairly? And really, when you're distributing assets, Family Feud, or kind of not having a family feud, is really more of an art than a science, right? It's the art of peacekeeping, because everybody's going to have a say at that point, and who should be involved and not. And once again, to your point, every family member has their own different strengths. So what are some of the strategies that you've seen implemented that ensure kind of this fair distribution? And if we're focusing here on real estate, right? So of real estate assets among heirs, but really it's all assets.
Absolutely. I'm going to back it up a little bit. I think part of the art is in being really intentional in advance. Yep. And so I've seen really a lot of success in families when they think about governance structure and creating guardrails well in advance of kids ever working in a business or having distribute assets or sell a business. Before they ever get there, thinking about things like who can actually work in the business? Can spouses work there? Do you have to go work somewhere else first? And can you come into the business? How will you determine compensation? How will interest be put into a family limited partnership? Will they be equally owned? All of those questions tend to come up at some point. And if you don't think about them in advance, like you said, they become, a point of contention and can cause a lot of family feud. So if you can't plan in advance, I think as a leader of a family, understanding that people will fill in the blanks if you don't communicate your intentions and what you're thinking about. So I think about a family, a real estate family that we worked with. They had 4 children, 3 worked in the business and had different roles. One, their daughter didn't work in the business at all. And the parents had kind of made assumptions that she was raising a family, she couldn't work in the business, and she didn't have the interest, but really she did. And so it ended up causing a lot of conflict amongst the family, and they had to back up and think about everyone's roles and responsibilities in the broader family and the family business in advance of ever actually thinking about how they distribute the assets amongst the kids. And so they hired some coaches, they hired me and worked with their financial advisor to think through how all those pieces would work so that they could hear all the kids' interests, what they were hoping for the future and all of their goals before making those decisions. Because at the end of the day, there's no way to make something like real estate distribution probably exactly equal for every kid. And so another piece of that is thinking through how you're going to deal with conflict. So how are we going to be able to have conflict as a family business and then sit down at a dining room table and have a lovely conversation as a family?
Right.
Because you have that, that unique position if you own a family business of being both. You have the boardroom table and the dining room table, and you have to figure out how to deal with problems in both scenarios and still love each other as a family. And so
that has to be incredibly tough. Yeah.
It is incredibly tough. And so I think overall, the more that you can communicate and make your intentions clear and have open conversations amongst kids and family members, the better it will go.
Yeah. Mike, what has been your experience kind of in when somebody's making these distribution of assets? I know, in your past life, you set up so many of these family offices, probably have seen a lot of family conflicts. What has been some of the strategies you've seen utilized?
I think Courtney nailed it. It's the recognition that there will be controversy, right? As much as you plan and want everything to go smoothly, something's going to happen. These are real life people. There's real life emotions involved that no matter how you can have a 2,000-page trust that tells everything that's supposed to go on, at the end of the day, there is going to be conflict. So understanding how to do that conflict resolution without breaking up the family or breaking up the family business, I think is, almost as important as all that pre-planning. One of the best success stories I've seen in a family office, I was a younger attorney, and I sat in a lot of family office meetings, and they actually almost did dry runs or laid out scenarios of, we get a great offer on the business, who, mom and dad are no longer there, who's making decisions. We lose our best client. Our EBITDA went from 80 million to 35 million. How are we handling this? What are we doing? Are we infusing more money? And they really, at the time, I'm like, this is ridiculous because they're playing make believe. But, once I sat in at it, I'm like, oh, I get it. They need to practice this type of communication, make sure everyone's ideas are out on the table while it's not prime time, right? When it's not, okay, this is really happening live now, we need to execute. So that was dry runs, which at the time, admittedly, I thought were a bit silly, turned out to be super impactful for just the understanding that, having that conflict in a fake scenario is a lot different than having a conflict in a real scenario. So playing out that conflict in make believe, okay, this happened. Our CEO quit, took 45% of our client base. Those type of scenarios playing out and understanding how everyone felt then, it prepared them for when there was real life conflicts and, business events happened.
I mean, in simple terms, it's like a fire drill, right? So you're just saying we do this all the time when we were in school. And, it's you have to prepare so you know what the plan's going to be. And that's kind of preparing for worst case scenario. To your point, if your EBITDA is dropping that much, it may not actually happen that significantly, but it could be a third of that, even a tenth of that. And now you've seen how to handle it, or you've experienced to a certain extent how to handle it. So you're able to handle it or to be able to control it if it does happen at whatever level.
I love that example, Mike. Thank you for sharing it. I love that you walk through what could be a horrible situation so that when it actually happens, it's probably going to be better.
Yeah.
And so your stress level, you've dealt with the level 10 scenario. So if you get a 6, it's no problem. I've got it handled. and it just feels easy. And so I love that can really, de-escalate the potential conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And also,
especially when you have, people in outside of people in the business, out of the business, helping those out of the business understand that like this business is very fluid in nature. You're very used to your quarterly distributions of X, Y, Z. What happens if those shut off for 2-3 years? Like, would you be able to understand that? And then to your point, if they have a bad quarter and the distribution doesn't come out that quarter, they've went through that scenario already in their head. They're able to more quickly, get their arms around it and move forward just because they've kind of lived it in a scenario.
I think also incorporating some of those younger generations, maybe I'm not talking the 5-year-old, I'm talking maybe now the teenagers, the 20-year-olds that are in college in those type of dry runs or fire drills, as you mentioned, like that would be such an incredible learning experience too, just to know, oh, this is how it's handled in business. And you may start to see that some of these folks thrive in a particular part of the business. They have ideas, or they may excel, or they may be smart at something that their family didn't give them credit for before.
Absolutely.
We've all been there. My mom still doesn't think I know anything about life insurance, and I've been in this space for 20 years. So, sometimes you have to prove yourself to the family. But no, that's a great example and a great pointer too of having those fire drills, dry run type of scenario. So in previous episodes, we've talked a lot about the show Succession, which you might have seen, Courtney. The Roy family, they're just known for their just the siblings not getting along, boardroom feuds that did transfer to the dinner table, and it never stopped. So, and then also as families progress, you have to think there's going to be spouses. There's going to be other voices at that dinner table that also have a say, that now have children who feel like my children aren't being treated fairly. We worked with a family a few years ago where there's 2 sisters. One of the husbands literally never says anything. The other husband is as outspoken as could be and had an opinion about everything. And so that caused a lot of conflict between the family. So knowing, as you all said, there's going to be conflict, especially as families grow, or if we have blended families too. What are some of the things you can do either to prevent it or even just to mitigate it? Like, how do you go from the boardroom conflict to the dinner table?
That's a great question. First, I want to go back to Succession because I feel like it needs to be a PSA of like, this is such a dramatization of how families act. And it's like the epitome of a trust fund baby, nepotism, all of the icky things that we think about when we think about wealth. And in my experience, I don't know about y'all, but I maybe have come across one family like that in the 100 families I've worked with.
We've seen snippets.
We've seen pieces of it.
Something that do remind us of some families.
Yes, but I feel like there's like this scary idea out there on television of like, this is what your family could become if you don't do these 12 steps that, all families should do. And so I want to like say to families that are listening is like, don't be that afraid of that happening. That is such an extreme scenario, and it's very rare to have that happen. But you brought up spouses and feuds, and something that we tell our clients all the time is that when you're thinking about a family, so many people think, from the trust perspective, they're like, okay, my lineal descendants, I have me and then my children and then their children. And they completely forget to think about spouses. We always tell families, okay, you can do all this training and you can talk about this in front of your grandkids all you want, but the people that are going to be teaching your grandchildren are their parents. Mm-hmm. They are 2 parents at home, and that includes your child's spouse. And so whether or not you want to include them is your choice, but we always recommend that you should on some level, because if one spouse is not being included and they're saying something way over here and you're trying to, integrate this learning for your grandchildren over here, it's going to create conflict down the road. So it's nice to have that open communication and inclusion of spouses to help have some consistency as you think about your entire family and your family legacy and what that could look like in the future. I also love the analogy. So many parents are afraid to tell their kids about how much wealth they have, or really open
just
up.
Thinking that.
Yeah, they're just I hear it all the time. And it's a completely understandable fear. my parents feel the same way. Like every parent's like, I don't want to tell my kids how much they make, like how much I make. That's silly. But I love the analogy of using a light switch, a dimmer switch. And it's like, if you can just turn on the light a little bit at a time and expose some of the information, it's so much better than just flipping on the switch. That's so much scarier to just say, you know, nothing. And now here is everything. So just think about like dripping out information a little bit at a time and shedding that light a little bit at a time. And it'll be so much more successful in my experience. And so I didn't know, Mike, do you have anything else to add on that from your experience?
I love that analogy because you're right. It's like, I always tell people like, they're going to know. So that use that analogy like, do you want just a spotlight high beam on them when you're passing, or would you like them to kind of slowly build into it?
They see your private plane. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a great analogy there. Yeah, I think that's just it. You know, again, you know, I always come over the tax lien, but you always see generation one, generation two, you know, that rising generation, they don't actually remember how old or capable they actually are, right? You know, the way they talk about them, you would think it's like a 7-year-old. And then I later find out, I was like, oh no, it's like a 45-year-old man who has an MBA from Wharton. I'm like, I think he can handle that.
Right, absolutely.
But the parent mentality is always like, that's my little kid. I don't want them to know this is this. So helping them understand, like, hey, you've done a good job. He's a well-adjusted adult now. I think it's time to, you know, start the conversation in the 20s and 30s. So I think that makes a lot of sense, but they can't conceptualize their baby ever being, you know, capable of understanding these types of concepts.
Good to know it's not just my family then. Everybody's family thinks you're not prepared. I was actually in the same day, about 2 weeks ago, I met with a financial advisor who has 2 50-year-old siblings who just inherited a lot of wealth, and their entire life they had no idea. I mean, they've gone through financial struggles, they had college debt, you know, all of the things, and their parents never told them the wealth that they had. They actually have legacy wealth from oil, some property great-grandparents had. And they were very resentful. I mean, their parents are past now, but they were very resentful of their parents for not, to a certain extent, helping them out when they knew that they could and preparing them for what was going to happen. And they also had have a very large estate tax bill that that nobody planned for because they just weren't prepared to share anything with them. That same day, I met with a business owner who is adamant about not sharing, to your point, Mike. He literally has a son with an MBA. So he owns this like private equity business, and he is adamant about not sharing any information with his children. And one of his sons is he's an accountant. He has an MBA. Like, he's incredibly smart, very capable, but just not comfortable. And we've just seen how tragic that can be over and over. And so that's an important lesson to take from today. It's better to prepare them slowly and maybe bite-sized, right, to your point, versus not telling them anything.
Did he tell you why he wasn't interested in telling children?
His stance was, if I tell them how much we have, then they're not going to work hard. His kids are grown. They have families. They've gone through college. It's not like I understand you might not tell an 18-year-old, hey, you're never going to have to work a day in your life, because that could lead to some really bad habits, right?
Yeah.
But these are grown adults who should know, especially if it's going to have tax implications or affect other aspects of their life. He just said, I just don't want them to stop working hard. That was his stance.
And I love hearing that, because I hear it all the time. And so I like to challenge, you know, clients and say, okay, well, let's think about how you raise these children. What kind of values did you raise them on? I'm sure you talked about how important working was and how, you know, giving back to your community, being a member of society, all of that is so important to you and has been an important part of your success. So they've seen that. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious, like, what they think. Where is the disconnect of, like, you've raised these children to act this way, and if they continue to act how you've taught them to act, they'd be exactly what you're looking for, and they won't squander the money. And it's funny you say that story. I had a similar client who she had the worst situation happen to her, that she just got a letter after her parents passed from the corporate trustee of her trust with a statement. No offering to meet, no nothing, no additional information. And she's like, what are you talking about? She had no clue. And her family owns a very large business. And she just had no clue. And they live in West Texas. They lived a very normal life.
Mm-hmm.
And she was then left to fill in the blanks and figure it out without them. And so I always encourage people, it's like, would you rather help someone fill in the story and answer the questions for them while you're around? Or do you want to wait until you're gone? And then, like you said, have resentment and confusion and say, why did mom and dad do this to me? Like, it doesn't feel like a kind thing to do, even if it has the best of intentions.
Yeah.
It can be such a burden instead of a gift. And it just leaves a lot of blanks to be filled in when they just don't need to be.
And I know other families, and I'm sure, Mike, you've seen this too. I just actually read an article on a woman, but this is a story we've seen over and over, where they come from wealthy families, and their family, and they know they're wealthy, but they've also said, we're not going to just give it to you. Show us that, you deserve it, kind of earn it, learn how to manage the business, do all the grunt work. Her family owns a car cleaning business, like one of the places where you go clean your car, but like a giant company of it, right? I'm totally downplaying it, but they have a lot of these places, and they made her wash cars to start. They're like, we want you to see every single aspect of the business. And now she has her own businesses, but that kind of, she built that grit because she saw the ins and outs of the business, and really understood all the hard work that it took on a day-to-day basis to run those businesses.
She probably truly felt those family values and what her parents went through, or her grandparents, to get to the place to have all of the resources that they have. And I love that for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I know that we've talked about, or you've probably heard the saying, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, right? And I think a lot of what's tied to that particular saying or quote is many times not just because there's a financial disconnect. It's because you don't have the 5-year-old that knows that that's the great grandmother that started the business, right? The legacy planning, the kind of the transfer of the legacy wasn't there. So how can families weave these important elements of also legacy, like what you mentioned? I think that's it. I'll keep repeating it, the 5-year-old story, into their planning, not just focusing on the financial.
Can I go back to the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So there has been a book and a lot of information come out about shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves come out recently, kind of debunking that research. So the research was done in the 80s. And actually what they did was only look within a certain industry. So it was manufacturing, I believe, in Illinois.
Okay.
And
so close to home, Mike.
Yeah.
Right.
And all they did was look at the businesses that were around in the 1920s and if they were still owned by the families in the 1980s. Huh. And that was the extent of the research. And it was a very narrow, I want to say it was only 100 families or 100 businesses. And so it didn't account for, they successfully sold the business or they had a successful transition plan to a non-family member. So none of that was taken into account.
Wow.
And so if it wasn't still held by the family at the end of that period, they were like, well, that accounts for part of the...
Must have been a failure.
It must have been a failure. So
it's an assumption, right?
Exactly. And I think the statistic is like only 30% of families make it, 70% fail, which is such a scary statistic for families. And it's also not including the context of, if you think about non-family businesses too, how many non-family businesses succeed for 60 or 80 years? So,
right.
You need to have all those different pieces of context. And so the story is not complete. Like it could happen. It could be shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, but it doesn't have to be, or it doesn't likely per se.
That is crazy. I've never heard the behind the story. It's kind of like shirt sleeve to shirt sleeve debunked, Mike, because we're like, this is what we've heard all the time, right?
And it's actually from this great book by Jim Grobman, Dennis Jaffe, and Kristen Keffler. They wrote this book, Wealth 3.0. So I recommend checking that out if you want to learn more about, they talk a lot about somehow in the past, a lot of advisors were approaching wealth advising from a real fear-based, it's only focusing on the money. And now we're building on that as we go into this Wealth 3.0 version and adding on to that to think about the topics that we're talking about today, thinking about family and legacy and people, in families more holistically and not just, we should be scared that the kids are going to all squander it. And definitely the grandkids are going to squander it.
That third generation gets a very bad reputation.
I know. I never want to be the third generation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then back to your question about legacy. So when we think about estate planning and reflecting family values and legacy, I want to back it up a little bit. I was thinking about an example about things just actually written in estate documents themselves. Mm-hmm. So if you think about a trust, even just making the decision of, can your children be their own trustee at some point? Is it at age 40? Can they never be a trustee? Can they only be a co-trustee? Even those simple decisions talk to your next generation about your values and what you see as your family legacy. And there was kind of an extreme example that from a family that I worked with. He had set up a trust for his grandchildren and only said that they could receive distributions if they were working. It wasn't just typical HIMSS, health, education, maintenance, support distribution. It was much more specific. You have to be working to get a distribution. And we knew what his intention was. He wanted them to be productive members of society, to have purpose, to be involved, to not be trust fund babies, quote unquote. But the actual reality of what he was telling his kids and his grandkids was like, I'm going to control you from
the grave.
the grave.
Yeah.
And I don't trust you to, live out a way that I have taught you aligns with our family values and what I'm hoping for and what my intention is. So we were able to facilitate a conversation between him and his children about that and say, okay, let's back up. What are you actually looking for? What about being a stay-at-home mom? Does that count as being a productive member of society? He's like, absolutely. Of course. It's like, okay, well, what about being a volunteer? Or, you do work, but you don't make a lot of money, and maybe that wouldn't count as being productive. But we were able to have that conversation, and he was able to refine that it wasn't actually work that he was looking for. It was just having purpose and being engaged and not just leaning on the inheritance. He wanted them to have the inheritance as a safety net, but not rely on it fully. And so that completely changed the conversation for the rising gen. And it went from, I'm controlling you, and here's the very narrow set of things that you can do in your future to receive trust distributions, to a much broader conversation about family values. And it was so important for the family to hear that from him. Another few examples that, from my background in philanthropy, I think that family foundations and donor advised funds are such a great way to incorporate family legacy into your estate planning. My only caveat is that I challenge families to think about it if they have a large foundation or donor advised fund that's going to be created at their death. Why not think about that during life? Why not walk alongside your family when you're there to really hash out what your family values, mission, your goals are, and your vision for your family assets? Instead, do that in life instead of waiting until death. So I really challenge people to think about that in advance. But I do think family philanthropy is such a great tool to share family values. Another thing that we've seen a lot is so many of the families that I've worked with value education. So setting up 529 plans, trust for education, really supporting your family in that way if education is really important for your family values and your legacy. Another piece that we recommend for families is not just completing your estate documents and then handing them over to your attorney to give to your family when you pass away.
That's what Mike used to do. You just be like, this is all you need to know.
This is all you need to know.
This paper is all that matters.
Yes. But we've seen families create letters of intent and, letters to their family about what this means, what they're hoping for, or even videos. There's so many great firms now that can create legacy videos so that your family can actually have you explaining your vision and your goals even when they're gone. If they're gone, you're gone, and it's your great-great-grandchildren that are able to watch that video or read that letter and know what your legacy is and what got you to where you were and why you were so successful. And giving that gift to your family, I think, is a really nice way to pair legacy alongside of estate planning.
Absolutely. And something you touched on, philanthropy, is really important. And something I've seen with clients is, the parents might be very loyal to a certain nonprofit, but now the next generation, their heart is elsewhere. They maybe are more passionate about dogs or cleaning water or so many other things. There's so many nonprofits that they can be involved in now. I think the key is showing them philanthropy is important in our family, but leaving some flexibility. So going back just a little bit, I have a funny story about a trust that was a little bit too rigid. We worked with this gentleman that his trust said he got distributions for several things, but one of them was when he got married, he would get a pretty significant distribution. Well, he figured out a loophole. It didn't say he only had to be married once. So he kept getting married and getting divorced, then getting married again and getting divorced. And when we met him, he was on his 7th marriage because every time he got married, it was almost like a business. At this point, honestly, he was giving part of his distribution to whoever decided to marry him because it didn't have to be a lavish wedding. They could just go get married at the courthouse and he would get a distribution. So I think also being wary of how exactly are you wording this? Like, what, to your point, like, what's the intent? The intent there wasn't for him to have a divorce, every year. It was for them to have a nice wedding. Here, we're giving back to you in the future, but that's not what it was used for. So
it's a great example of like intent versus actuality. And it's like, I'm sure that family, like you said, wanted them to have a great wedding. They really valued family. They wanted to support them in having a great launching pad. But that is such a great example of the discrepancy between those two things. I love that story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, those stories are great for just, making families understand that estate planning documents are not meant for, like you said, ruling beyond the grave, because there's going to be situations and circumstances in the future that you don't account for that is not going to be with your wishes. So, Courtney, that why behind decisions are made, that letter of intent, or that I think that's the most important part of the estate plan, because more times than not, I see that the beneficiaries or next generations aren't necessarily upset with the decision making. It's just there's no explanation behind, why things are the way they are. So we always encourage, once we get the decisions on the table, we ink it up like, okay, now we have to go explain your intent for these 500-page documents, and really help them understand that really leads to more cohesive estate planning and family unit. Is just, okay, I get it. I understand that I need to be gainfully employed because that's what grandpa wanted, or, do X, Y, Z because this, that, and the other thing, not just, oh, it says I have to have a job. So now I'm going to spike grandpa and go get a job one day a week, setting up beach chairs at the resort next to my house, which is a real example that I've lived. So like the more they don't know, the more they try to find loopholes, like you said, Celeste.
People get real creative.
Going in with the intent and understanding, and really help them understand that you're not trying to be mean. You're not trying to rule beyond the grave, but there are certain parameters you wanted to put on this thing so that your legacy is intact.
Yeah, people get real creative with how to get a trust distribution.
They do. And that brings me to something that I have learned from my experience working with families. It is so important to think about who the trustee is of the trusts. And, if it's not going to be that child or grandchild, making sure that it is someone who is reasonable, understands actually the lives of the beneficiaries, can think through creative situations and make decisions that are in line with your intent and your legacy and your goals for your family. So I just really like to remind families that trustees have a lot of control over how assets are used. And it can be a point of contention for families if there is a trustee who doesn't understand the needs of the family. And sometimes it is great to have a corporate trustee, but sometimes it's better to have a family friend. So just thinking about what that means and what it'll look like down the road.
And also, we've seen where one of the siblings is the trustee and now the other kids hate that sibling because you're controlling our money, right? So think about what is it going to cause more problems versus be a good solution for your family. So what is the right solution? And just kind of to wrap up the legacy portion, kind of what I've heard you say, both of you, is make sure you say it during your lifetime. Help them understand the why versus here's how I'm going to do it. Teach them about it at a pace that makes sense for them. and trust your kids a little bit more. We all know that in every family, there's one kid that's probably more responsible and maybe one that not as much. But everybody has their strengths that they can play to. So it's preparing them during your lifetime. So the key is prepare them, right?
Yeah. And I love what we said earlier. My dad still does this. I've worked with him for the past 10 years. So we had a little bit of this relationship of we work together and we're father-daughter.
Yeah.
And I still have to remind him that, Dad, I am not 10 years old anymore. I am not your little girl.
Well, you'll always be his little girl.
I will always be his little girl.
Yeah.
But I mean, helping, such a mentally helping parents and grandparents transition from, this is not the irresponsible child who spent all their allowance when they were 12. It's like, okay, they're 40 years old now. They, like you said, they have an MBA. They have a great job. They have a wonderful family of their own. So thinking through as a parent, combining those stories and saying, yes, maybe as a little kid, they weren't great with money, but they have aged 30 years and they have a lot of life experience. So maybe giving them the benefit of the doubt and saying, look at all these great things that they've done and using that to make your decisions for going forward.
Absolutely. And when you talked about, or when you debunked the shirt sleeves to short sleeves, my mind is still blown, right? That's how that study was created. But when you talked about that, you mentioned sometimes the family business has to transition to somebody else, right? Sometimes that next generation isn't the best group to pass it to, or they don't want the business. My dad has a business that my brother and I don't want to be involved in, right? We're telling him to sell it. It's just not what we do, not something we're passionate about. So I think, Mike, this really plays into a lot of what you see every day, your areas of expertise. So we have the next generation. And if we go back specifically, we've been talking a lot about real estate. We have a real estate business that's thriving, but it doesn't work for the family. So we know we're going to have to sell it. So what are some of the things that the family can do to ensure that they're preparing the business to be sold in the most optimal manner and that's helpful for all of the family?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I think that's to get to this point, to Courtney's earlier point, that's a step in the right direction, right? There's the amount of times that I've been, approached by a matriarch, a patriarch saying, hey, we have this amazing business. We need to set up trust so that it goes to my three children in this portion, and this one's going to be CEO, and this one's going to be CFO, and this one's going to be head of sales. And, me and my group would go into our tax nerdery and big spreadsheets and boxes and arrows and really figure out, okay, what's the best, most tax efficient way to get this to them? A little while later, we get the whole group together, and then the kids are like, I have a job. I don't want to run this company for you.
I'm a musician. So
yeah, it's like, why would you possibly think I want to do this? Yeah. So, that stung me a few times earlier in my career. So the fact that they're at the point of, okay, despite the fact this is my family legacy and, I understand that my kids don't want it, what now? How could I get to a place where we're, really thinking about legacy, but in that the church sleeve example, I still think it'd be a success if they had a good exit and the family still had a good, liquidation event where they could do philanthropy, they can invest in, where it could be generational money. So, at that point, I always think that the next step, obviously being a tax nerd, is, really understanding where your structure currently is and what benefits you could, improve on before you go to market, as far as, okay, what if we decided to move some of the assets to this trust or this family member? What type of sale are we going to market with? Would it be much better from tax impact from our side if we look at a real estate sale into a REIT, into a 1031, if we try to, have some type of structured settlement or structured payments over time? Those are really the things that, from my perspective, it leads to a better exit from a dollar perspective, at least, because of the fact that we've thought through all these things. So we've narrowed our market of people we want to approach, right? Like private equity might not be the right fit for what we're trying to accomplish here, or, those type of items before you start going to market. Because once you go to market, it's hard to put the toothpaste back into the tube, as far as, well, we really should have done this first. We really should have looked at this type of, potential buyer. So I think, the first step is just working with CPA and tax counsel and really saying, okay, we've made a decision that we want to sell within the next year to 18 months. What steps should we be taking now to make sure that when we do, get that banker on board, he's out there selling our properties, that we're going to keep the most after-tax dollars.
I think to your point, it's preparing that year to 18 months. We see so many business owners and all of us and say, I'm just going to sell my business. And they haven't prepared it to kind of, be in its best light, right? Like be in your most optimal, prom dress or whatever you want to call it, to be able to be for lots of other people to want to look at the business and buy it. So preparing is kind of the key here too, is preparing the business. And I would say for our audience and viewers to stay tuned, because we plan on doing a whole series on exit planning for business, because there's just so much that we can talk about how to prepare before. But those are some good points, Meg. Just start to prepare, have that conversation. And I would say even if you start to see that your heirs, this is not for them early on, start to think about that this is probably going to be more of a sell than a transition in the future. And I think you can probably start to see that in some of your children or and whoever it is in the family that you think is going to take over the business many years before you decide to sell it.
It's not only an opportunity cost to, do it earlier than later, but, when push comes to shove and you're negotiating and you're fine tuning the deal, you're not going to want to worry about the tax or saying, oh, wait, we should take this election or we should have done it. So if you get it done in the front, you can go into it with a clear eye saying, okay, I'm in the best position now to maximize my after-tax value. And then I would only add one more thing is, you kind of want to have the family as a whole thinking about, okay, what do we do on the other side of this, right? How much do we want to go to philanthropy? What are our investment philosophies? What are our distribution philosophies before it all happens? Because once the money hits, you're going to have a little bit of deal, exhaustion. But then eventually you're going to wake up and be like, okay, I don't know what to do. I've been running this real estate empire for 40 years of my life. I don't know what to do with just this pile of cash I'm not sitting on. So it's really parallel pathing those two items, not really going, okay, let's just get to the finish line. And then, okay, let's go find an investment or a philanthropy group that we like to work with. It's okay, let's get the sale. But once the sale process is going, let's almost go through those dry runs, those fire drills as far as, okay, we've received a check for X amount of money. Like how much do we want to put in philanthropy? How much do we want to invest in this sector, in impact investing? Those type of items are very important also. So those two parallel paths, once you come to that determination that this really isn't a legacy business, are very, very important.
And charitable intent can have significant tax advantages, right? So how much do I want to pay to the IRS is kind of a question you should ask yourself as you're preparing to sell a business. And is it, if I am charitable, what kind of planning can I do before the sale of a business, which a lot of business owners are not aware of? You can do charitable planning prior to a sale and make it a much more tax efficient sale for you as well. If you do it before. And I mean, that's something we reiterate all the time.
Definitely before. Many donor advised funds can accept something like real estate assets or other unique assets or S Corp share. They can accept that in advance of a sale, but you need to think about it, like we said, 12 to 18 months in advance to have that separation. But it's a great thing to think about before the sale of the business.
And you also don't want your kids to hate you if 20% of it went to that nonprofit that you're so passionate about and that they don't care, because now that's 20% that they didn't get, right?
Yes.
So you also need to be mindful of that. So, and the next question, Micah, it'll be for you, but it's something, once again, that we can talk about for hours, and we definitely will develop a whole series around this conversation. But great, I sold my business. I have all this cash. Now what? Like, what do we do?
Right. Yeah. So, that thought process of how do I want to approach my wealth? Like I said, if you started at the kind of the front end of the sales cycle, it helps you really at least have a high level game plan going forward, because everyone approaches their wealth differently. All of a sudden someone has a big pot of assets and they say, wow, well, I got a lot of cash now. I probably need a family office. And they'll call me or one of my colleagues and be like, hey, set me up with one of these family office things. It's like, oh, why? What do you need? Or, Courtney, on the flip side, oh, I should probably just have a private foundation. I got a ton of cash. And it's like, well, are you just cutting checks? Do you really want to have an operating private foundation? Like, what does this look like? Like, what is your view for, how you're approaching your wealth and how you're approaching your charity? And then that'll help them really kind of layer in, okay, what type of structure is good for them? But yeah, it's a lot of, they hear a lot of different ideas from a lot of different people at the country club, and they're kind of overwhelmed. So it's like, well, that's their structure and that's their charitable, structure, but they're two totally different people than you. Like, what do you want your legacy to look like? And then we'll structure around that. So I think that's the most important thing, is understanding that you really need to customize that family office, that foundation, whatever you're really looking at, to suit what you want your legacy to be, not what your neighbor's legacy looks like.
I think you just wrapped it all up. What do you want your legacy to look like? And then we can structure it. Right? And that comes back to preparing your heirs. Are they going to take over the business? Is it going to be a sale of a business? What are you going to do with the money? All of that comes into what is your legacy? What do you want your legacy to look like? And as we've gone through the conversation, the keys are preparation for whoever, whether it's the heirs or for the sale of the business. It's not easy. There's going to be conflict. There's going to be chatter. There's going to be more voices involved as the families grow. But if there's that open, honest communication, there's intent. If many generations, the family retreat, if the great grandparents are still there to talk to those young, children, I think that's so impactful. I recently had a client mention that her family had one of those videos recorded of her great grandpa who had started a business. It was tiny and grew into something very significant. And having the ability to hear his voice was so meaningful to her. And I think we take that for granted, right? It made me think, like, what am I doing to preserve something for my child of my parents? So thank you both so much. This has been great. All of our conversation is, I think we've learned a lot. We debunked something that we thought was true. We've heard about families, good ones, bad ones, maybe not as bad as Succession, but they're
that's a great thing. Yeah. No one wants that.
Celeste, is there any chance I could ask Courtney some pointers for me, my CPAs, other financial advisors who, notice that there is a need for, that type of, what Courtney's group provides as far as open communication. You're really starting that conversation. I love the term you use, fill in the blanks, because, at the end of the day, these families understand they're wealthy. They're the only ones getting picked up at college on a private jet and flown out the Vail. Like they get it, but like helping them start that conversation from an
advisor
professional who they don't look for that type of advice, right? I'm very much a stay in my lane type guy, but if those type of things happen, what kind of introductions, what kind of things can we ask them or talk to them about that don't seem overbearing from the estate planner guy?
Mm-hmm. So I think that there's some simple questions that you can ask if you feel comfortable. Just starting the conversation with something simple like, okay, let's think about what you all have been doing as a family. What has been working well? What are you hoping to accomplish in the future? How can we help you find the right partners to do that? Really coming at it from a positive perspective and looking at a family and saying, what have y'all been doing well? What do you want to take into the future? And how can I help you find the right partners to do that? Whether it be financial advisors or consultants like myself, or, a donor advised fund provider, how can I help you create the right team based on your goals and help you reflect that in a very holistic way so it feels very authentic for you and your family? And there's not going to be one right solution for every family. And so I like to reiterate that, like, you're not doing it right or wrong. Mm-hmm. You need to do it in the way that is right for you, in the right pace and the right time frame with the right people. And so there's no one size fits all. And so I think, Mike, that can be your role, is just starting that conversation. And I think normalizing this, especially if someone's gone through a big change, they're not only going through a change in their financial picture, they're also going through a change in identity. Mm-hmm. They have gone from being a CEO and now they're just a person.
Grandpa.
Yeah, they're just a grandpa or a dad or a friend. And that can be a really hard transition for people.
Yeah.
And so normalizing that as something that is a big change. And there are people that can help. There are people that can walk alongside you, and you don't need to feel rushed to do anything. I just think that being empathetic and listening and and just being willing to help them get to whatever goals they identify. And it's okay if they have no goals as well. I want to like normalize that too, is like, if you just sold a business, you were probably really busy for the past 18 months. And you probably had no time to think about, what do I see my foundation looking like? You know, that's kind of a silly question to be thinking about probably when you're selling your business. And so I think that is what I would say for you, Mike, to think about when you're working with families.
Super helpful, because, it's not our, not what they pay us to do. So at the end of the day, you kind of don't want to overstep your bound, but at the same time, when you do see an opportunity or something, I immediately, probably in the wrong way, like think of like horror stories of what happens, and we just talked about a handful and we joked about that, but so it's like, well, that can't be the best way to approach it. Say, hey, if you don't do this, you're going to turn into this guy. But at the end of the day, my profession is almost doing it a disservice by not making that more of a priority. And I think it's mainly because of the fact that we don't know how to approach it, right? We don't understand how to go from, well, here's how your GST trust works to, this type of much more important stuff.
You have feelings. You don't have feelings, Mike?
That's the word that's looking for.
Don't worry, Mike. It doesn't have to be all about feelings. You can number out goals in a list. It can be a little bit less.
You can use spreadsheets for this.
Yes.
Yes. I love spreadsheets.
I love spreadsheets.
But something that you said, that person that transitioned their business, they shouldn't just see themselves as a pocketbook, because if they're still living, they still have a really important role in that family. There's still a lot that they can do from a legacy perspective and shaping that, right? And it continues to be shaped even if they've already been through a transition. So that's great. That's very helpful to hear, Courtney, even for me as well, because we just don't think about it. I mean, we know it and we've seen the horror stories. Sometimes bringing it up in conversation is not as easy as it probably should be.
And maybe share some of these great stories. I mean, Mike, you talked about the family who was doing these role plays and how it worked out so well. So we all have these great stories of families who have thrived. And so I think as professionals, we can tell more of those stories and tell, we can laugh at the secessions of the world, but tell about how there's been so many successful families and that it can look in a lot of different ways. I feel like sometimes families get stuck on, this is the only path. And if I'm not on this path, I'm not successful.
Yep.
So thinking about that, the path to success can look in a lot of different ways. There's no right or wrong.
Yep, absolutely.
That's awesome. Appreciate that. Sorry for the sidebar, Celeste.
No, not at all. No, that was a great question.
Like, hey, how do we help this whole cycle?
That is a great question, because I think it's something that wasn't talked about before. Because I don't know, before, estate and financial planning there was not a lot of emotion in it. And not that it has to be, to your point, emotional or touchy-feely, but there is a part of it that goes way beyond just dollars. And I do think that when there's no planning there, that could be the short sleeves to short sleeve story that goes to complete waste, because there's no real ties into the family anymore, and that could affect it. But well, thank you both very much. Thanks again, Courtney. We really appreciate it. So if our audience listeners are interested in connecting with you, eager to learn how to prepare their heirs and, want to get past all the stale conversations that we have, how can they connect with you?
They can find me on LinkedIn under my company name, Mariposa Advisors, or just through my personal LinkedIn as well, Courtney Joyner Gage.
Perfect. Thank you. And we'll also include Courtney's contact information in the show notes with the video and, of course, with the audio as well. So for those of you watching or listening, we really appreciate you joining us today. Hopefully this series of building wealth through real estate has been helpful as you're not just growing your business, but you're thinking of the next steps. Once again, if you haven't seen the previous episodes, please check them out. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and please be sure to follow on your favorite podcast player. To connect with us, you can email us at hello@robinglenn.com or schedule some time with us via the link in the show notes. You can also find us on Instagram and TikTok at Hello Robin Glenn.